For more on this, we're being joined now by foreign policy principal at Trilogy Advisors, John Sitilides. John, thanks for being here this evening. As always, Japan and the U.S. have called an emergency UN Security Council meeting following that missile launch on Tuesday, calling for an international embargo on oil exports of North Korea. But China and Russia sit on this permanent panel, right? And they have veto powers. They will definitely object to this. So that measure is not going to pass. What recourse does the U.S. and Japan really have available to them?
Well, Manila, first of all, let me just agree with you that the UN is more of a diplomatic step, but it's not really going to provide the kind of toolkit that's necessary to give us the options that we need to achieve both denuclearization of North Korea and also behavior change by the regime. Those are the twin objectives of the United States and the international community. And that's going to happen largely because China is going to have to be persuaded it's in its own interest to be able to change the behavior of the regime, or there'll be economic consequences for China, or there'll be a significant beefing up of U.S. military assets throughout the Pacific region.
Well, apart from, I mean, that's punishment to China if they don't play along with us.
China has played an instrumental role in helping North Korea develop its ballistic nuclear weapons going back several decades. And China has basically sat out this entire process and made it largely a U.S.-North Korea process. But it's not. China has more influence than any other country in the world on North Korea. If they want to avert any kind of calamity in the region, they're going to have to play a much more significant role here, and a much more constructive one.
That's really interesting to hear that China, to hear anybody say that China's actually taken part in why they've become a nuclear state. So that's an interesting piece of news, I think, for a lot of people. But theoretically, if some sort of oil ban did come to fruition, what sort of response might we see out of Pyongyang over it?
My concern is that there have been prior economic sanctions on North Korea, and the regime really doesn't care. Right? I mean, that's really the unfortunate part. There are 26 million citizens of North Korea, and their well-being is not the concern of the regime. Their concern is twofold. One, absolute preservation of the regime in power, and secondly, being able to eventually absorb South Korea and reunify the Korean Peninsula under the Kim regime. And developing nuclear weapons is a deterrent against the United States from being able to prevent North Korea's long-term strategy.
So many say that this oil embargo is the last diplomatic card, the last card that Tokyo and Washington have. If that's true, then now what? If China doesn't play along, like they said that they haven't, they said if the U.S. strikes first, they're going to side with North Korea. Where do we go from here?
The oil ban is one very, very tiny step. The real punitive measures against China for not playing a more constructive role would be secondary sanctions imposed by the United States on Chinese companies and individuals who are doing business with North Korea. This would have a very deleterious effect on the Chinese economy. And keep in mind, Xi Jinping is looking to stay in power for another 5, perhaps 10 years, and there are a number of Communist Party activities this fall. He needs to have as few problems on China's periphery as possible. Luckily, they solved a crisis with India just the other day, but they cannot afford to let North Korea spin out of control. And if the U.S. feels it has limited options, there'll be a lot more pressure on China to step up to the plate.
Can President Trump play a larger, more direct role in how China-U.S. relations are, especially with business, like with Foxconn moving to the U.S.?
I think this should be a partnership. Again, ideally, China and the U.S. would work together, not in a way that would be inimical to China's long-term interests. This has to be in China's interests and also that of the U.S., but frankly, also Japan and South Korea. The last thing China wants is for Japan to develop its own nuclear weapons arsenal. The memories of the rape of Nanking and World War II, as well as historical memories, are still very pronounced in China. But if Japan feels it has no recourse, it'll develop its own nuclear arsenal, and the U.S. will likely put nuclear weapons back on the South Korean peninsula as they had up until the early 1990s.
So it sounds like how we address China has to be more of the carrot, less of the stick.
The carrots, I think, are finished.
All right. Thank you so much for your expertise, John Sitilides.